In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to incorporate motion blur into our rendered images. Okay, so motion blur is one of those things that is really easy to add to our scene, and it can really just sort of help add a little bit of extra polish and a little bit more believability to our rendered images. So we have things in our scene like the ship that is moving up and down. We have these fan blades that are spinning around. We have areas like this hose that are sort of popping out really violently, the camera zooming back. But if you take a render at what we have, what you'll see is that one of the major things that's missing is motion blur. So motion blur is one of those kind of funny little things. It's something that we see all around us in the world every day. It's a natural part of how the human vision system works. Motion blur is also something that is a part of just about how every motion camera works. And motion blur is one of those things where you really don't even notice it when it's there. But if it's not there, something just doesn't look quite right in the scene, even if you're not consciously aware of what it is. And sometimes that missing little something is motion blur. So let's take a render at this current frame. Looks like right now I'm at about frame 126. So we can save this image for comparison. And now let's go into the render settings and turn on motion blur. So in Mental Ray, we're going to go into the render settings. Let's go over into this features tab. Let's scroll down and look for motion blur. You can see by default it's turned off. Now we have two different types of motion blur that we can choose from: no deformation and full. Let's start with the full motion blur, and let's just see what that looks like. So we're going to save this image for comparison and now re-render. Alright, so if you take a look at what we have now and what we had before, there's at this point really not just a tremendous amount of difference. So I might need to pick a little bit better frame to actually show this with. So let's maybe try to pick one of these frames where we have lots of movement happening. So there we go. Let's try something like around frame 155. There we go, and now we can start to see some motion blur applied to that frame. So if I were to save that for a comparison, and again maybe see what this looks like without motion blur, just so we can have a little bit more accurate comparison. Okay, so this is what we have with motion blur and without. So you can definitely tell that this one with motion blur just seems a little bit more realistic. It just kind of helps to add as or act as just a little bit of extra polish to kind of help your eye or your mind believe that this is something that could be real or something that could have been filmed through a motion camera or through a photographic camera. Now, unfortunately, as is the case with just about everything that makes your scene look good, this motion blur does start to add a little bit of render time, unfortunately. So in my case, render time was just a little over 1 minute for the frame without motion blur. For the frame with motion blur, we jump up to about 1 minute 20 seconds. So not a huge increase, but the time difference that you experience between a scene with motion blur and a scene without motion blur can be very different from scene to scene, depending on how complex your scene is, on how close your motion blurred objects are to the camera, how much of the frame they take up. Sometimes it may be a really small difference in render time. Other times it may be 2, 3, sometimes 4 times increase in your render speed or in your render time. So if you have the time to spare, then I would definitely recommend turning on motion blur if you have the computing horsepower and the time to dedicate to having motion blur in your scenes. There are some ways of getting around this where you can get into some compositing tricks where you can start to shave off a lot of your render time by rendering out separate motion vector passes and using those for compositing. Now that's a pretty advanced process, so we're not going to touch on that in this course. But if you want to learn more about that, then Digital Tutors actually has a number of different courses where we discuss motion vector rendering and motion vector passes, things like that. Now, one of the issues that we have, or one of the things that I want to show you, is the difference between this no deformation and full motion blur. Now I'll try to find a frame that has some good motion blur in it, what I might actually do is switch to my perspective camera to show you this. So I'll try to get in here, maybe a little bit closer, and try to frame up areas like this hose, some of these parts of the ship. Try to get in here a little bit closer. I might turn on my resolution gate so I can make sure I get these all framed up. Okay, now let's come in and take a quick render of this with full motion blur applied. So in this case we have motion blur being applied to just about everything in the scene. If you look very closely, you can see just a little bit of motion blur that's being applied to these fan blades. We have motion blur that's being applied to this hose as it's sort of popping out and whipping around. We should also have motion blur applied to the ship as it starts to speed away. So when it comes to animating and moving things in Maya, really there are two different methods of animation. One is just basic translation animation, where we could take something like this ship, grab its controller, move it around in space, and animate it that way. Now another kind of animation is deformation animation. That's usually things that are bone-based. So in this case it would be something like this hose that is being deformed and driven by a set of bones. This would also be a lot of characters and character objects in your scene. So with this motion blur set to full, it's going to apply motion blur to everything. Now with no deformation, what that means is that any objects in our scene that are being animated by some kind of a deformation effect, these will not receive any motion blur. So in this case, what we should see with this no deformation is whenever we render that, everything in our scene should still have motion blur applied, except for something like the hose, which in this case, again, is being driven by deformation. And you can see that that is exactly what we get. So with full motion blur, you can see that everything is blurred. With the no deformation, you can see everything is still motion blurred, except for this little hose here. Okay, so again, motion blur is one of those things that's really, really easy to add. It does take a little bit of extra render time, but a lot of times that little bit of extra render time is well worth the wait.